The frost came early to Coldwater Junction that December, arriving not with a slow creep of ordinary cold, but with the sudden absolute authority of a verdict already decided. It sealed the mud in the streets into ridged iron, turned the horse troughs to solid blocks, drew ferns of ice across every window in town by the second night of the month. People who had lived in Wyoming territory for 20 years said they had never felt December arrive with quite this conviction, as though the season itself had somewhere to be and intended to get there before anyone could object. Eleanor Voss sat in the front room of the Coldwater Junction Town Hall on the morning of December 5th and did not look at her hands. She had learned this in the 8 weeks since Thomas died. Looking at her hands was dangerous. They were his hands now in some way she could not explain, and did not try to explain the same rough knuckles, the same particular callus on the right index finger from holding a tool the wrong way for 20 years and refusing to change. Looking at them in quiet moments had a way of pulling her under, and she did not have time to be pulled under. She had not had time for that since the morning she pressed a wet cloth to his forehead for the last time and felt the heat go out of him like a lamp being turned down. Thomas was the one who named things. He had that gift, the ability to reach into the air and pull out the right word for whatever she was carrying inside. She had spent 30 years handing him feelings the way you hand someone a tool you cannot identify, and he would look at it, turn it over once, and say the word. She thought about that now, sitting in the town hall with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the far wall. What would he call this morning? What word would he reach for? He would not be sitting, that much she knew. Thomas would have stood. The hall smelled of wet wool pipe smoke and the particular stale warmth of a room where men had been sitting too long with a decision already made. 12 of them ranged around the long oak table, and Eleanor knew every face. She had lived in this town 6 years. She had brought soup to the Alderman family when their youngest had the fever. She had helped Martha Foley press apples 3 consecutive autumns. She knew which dogs on Commerce Street would bite. The table itself was Thomas's work. He had built it 3 years ago on commission from the council, spent 6 weeks on it, after his regular hours, came home with sawdust in his hair and pride in the set of his shoulders. She could see from where she sat, the place where his plane had caught the grain wrong and left a shadow in the wood. A mistake so slight that no one else would ever notice it. A mistake she would have recognized anywhere in the world. The men who were about to take everything Thomas had built were resting their arms on the table Thomas had built with his hands. She chose not to think about that. Harold Mercer sat at the far end with the settled ease of a man who had long since made peace with his own authority. He was 58, brought across the chest with the particular solidity of someone who had never in his adult life gone hungry and had made a careful study of ensuring that condition would continue. As the owner of the only supply store within 40 miles of Coldwater Junction, he controlled the movement of flour, salt, ammunition, kerosene, and coffee through the worst months of the year. He did not need to be feared. He only needed to be present when the alternatives ran out. What Eleanor had never fully understood until this morning was that Mercer had not been born into this position. She had heard it once years ago from his wife Catherine said, in passing over a counter with the offhand weight of things a woman mentions because she has been carrying them too long. Mercer had come to Wyoming in 1861 with $40 and a letter of introduction from a brother-in-law in St. Louis. He had built the store with his own hands when the town had no name, and he had lost his first wife and his firstborn son in the same winter of 1865, within 3 weeks of each other, to a fever that the nearest doctor was 40 miles away from treating. Something in him had turned to something harder after that. Eleanor understood hardness. She did not mistake it for evil, but she understood sitting at his table that hard men sometimes did things they believed were simply practical, and that the people crushed by those things experienced something different than practicality. His face when he finally looked at her had the expression of a man reading a bill of sale. Not unkind, not cruel, simply engaged in the arithmetic of a situation that had already resolved itself in his mind before she walked through the door. He cleared his throat once, a sound that fell into the room like a stone into still water. The property charter of Coldwater Junction, he said, was specific on the matter of land claims. Upon the death of the registered signatory, all land reverted to township management unless a male heir of working age was present to assume the claim. There was no male heir. The claim on the Voss property would be absorbed by the township before the first of the year. She had until sundown today to gather what she needed. The town would provide one day's rations as a gesture of goodwill. He said gesture of goodwill, the way a man says it when he means the conversation is over. Eleanor did not speak. There were things she could have said about the 3 years of labor she had put into that property alongside Thomas, about the kitchen garden that had supplied half the town through the summer before last when the Harlow Creek farms flooded, about the fact that Thomas's table was holding up the men who were deciding to take everything he had built. She did not say any of them. The energy required for words she already knew would not matter was energy she could not spare. She sat with her hands flat on the table fingertips, just touching the wood, and she felt through the grain of it something that was either the memory of Thomas's hands or her own imagination. And she kept her face still, and she did not cry, and she said nothing at all. At the back of the room near the door that led to the hallway in the street beyond, her mother sat in the chair she had brought from home because the town hall chairs were straight-backed hardwood with no give, and Agnes Pryor Weston's spine, after 70 years of use, had opinions about furniture. She was small in the chair, small in the way of people who have been slowly editing themselves down across decades, subtracting weight and volume until what remains is purely essential. Her hair was white. Her skin was the color and texture of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times. Her hands rested in her lap with the stillness of something set down carefully. But her eyes, pale gray and sharp as a hawk working a thermal, had not left Harold Mercer's face since he began speaking, and they were doing something to his composure that he was too practiced to show, but not practiced enough to fully conceal. Agnes had known the verdict 3 days ago. She had read it in the way Mercer's gaze slid past Eleanor whenever their paths crossed on Commerce Street, in the way the other council members' wives had stopped meeting Eleanor's eyes at the dry goods counter. She had known it and said nothing because saying it early would not have changed it and would only have given Eleanor more time to prepare an argument that was never going to be heard. When Mercer finished, he turned his attention to a point on the wall above Eleanor's head with the satisfied air of a man who has discharged a difficult duty efficiently. Eleanor rose. She did not push the chair back with any particular force. She did not slam her palms on the table. She did not raise her voice, did not do any of the things that would have given the men around her a story to tell afterward about how she had lost her composure, how women always lost their composure in situations that required steadiness. She stood up straight. She looked at Harold Mercer directly and, without expression, for a count of 3. Then she turned toward the door. Agnes was already rising from her chair, moving with the careful deliberateness her body now required, folding the blanket she kept across her knees into a neat square. She did not ask what had been decided. She had heard every word. They walked out into the cold together, the door closing behind them with a click that was not loud but landed in the silence like something final. In the hallway, a man was waiting. Roy Taft was 35 broad through the jaw, with the close-cropped mustache of a man who took his duty seriously, in the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to know when he was doing the wrong thing and not yet enough to know how to do otherwise. He was the deputy sheriff of Coldwater Junction, and he had an envelope in his hand, and the expression on his face was that of a man who had drawn a task nobody wanted and intended to carry it out anyway because that was what the job required. He held the envelope out. Eleanor did not take it immediately. She looked at him instead, and what she saw in the set of his jaw and the way he was not quite meeting her eyes told her everything she needed to know about what he thought of this particular morning's work. "You knew this house when it was 4 posts in the ground," she said. "Not an accusation, a fact. The kind of fact a person needs to hear said aloud so they can carry it properly." "Mrs. Voss." His voice was level and professional and cost him something. "I know you did," she said. "I remember you asking Thomas about the joinery on the east wall." She took the envelope from his hand. "This will be the thing you remember about today. I want you to know I understand that." Roy Taft did not answer. He stepped aside and walked down the hallway ahead of her, and he did not turn around when he reached the street, and that particular refusal to turn around was the act of a man preventing himself from changing his mind. At the back of the hallway near the door that branched toward the council chambers, Ward Hollis stood. He was 38, a member of the council, a man Eleanor had known since he and his wife Aggie had come to Coldwater Junction in 1884. She had helped Aggie press apples. She had sat with both of them through the fever that took their first child in the winter of 1886. She had known Ward Hollis through the kind of shared difficulty that strips away the surface of a person and shows what is underneath. He was looking at the wall beside him with the careful attention of someone who has decided very deliberately not to see what is standing directly in front of them. Ward, Eleanor said. He looked up. In his eyes, there was something she recognized, not because it was a simple thing, but because she had watched enough people carry enough difficult truths to know what it looked like when a person had made a decision and was still living in the room with what the decision had cost. I'm sorry, Eleanor, he said. His voice was low enough that no one else in the building would have heard it. I know, she said. She did not say more than that. She did not need to. The distance between being sorry and doing something was the exact width of the table Thomas had built, and Ward Hollis had sat on the wrong side of it this morning, and they both understood that. She walked past him and out into the cold. The main street of Coldwater Junction was nearly empty. Two men with their collars turned up moved quickly toward the feed store. A dog stood at the corner with his nose working the air. The cold was a physical presence, not merely an absence of warmth, but an active force pressing in from all sides, finding the gap between collar and neck, finding the thin spot in a boot sole, finding every place where a person was not quite protected enough. Eleanor's breath came out in clouds that dispersed immediately, as if even the air refused to hold on to anything. She had thought, in the abstract way you think about things you do not expect to actually face, that the moment of losing the house would feel like something breaking. A clean snap. What it felt like instead was more like the moment after a clean snap, when you are still holding the two pieces and the pain has not arrived yet, and your body is running on the primitive certainty that the next step has to happen regardless. The next step was Catherine Mercer. She was standing outside the entrance to her husband's store with her arms crossed over her chest and a look on her face that Eleanor had never seen there before. Not the careful blankness Catherine usually wore in public like a second skin, but something raw and tightly controlled, a rope under tension. She was a small woman, 52 years old, with a face that had been pretty once and was now something better than pretty, something specific. Every year of the life she had lived with Harold Mercer was written in the set of her jaw and the lines at the corners of her eyes, and if you knew how to read what was written there, it was not a comfortable text. Eleanor stopped. Catherine looked at her for a moment without speaking, looked at Agnes standing a step behind. Then she moved toward Eleanor with the quick, certain motion of someone who has been waiting for a window and knows it will not stay open long. She pressed a small bundle into Eleanor's handcloth, wrapped tight around something that crinkled slightly. Something small. Before Eleanor could speak, Catherine's hand closed over hers for 1 second. A pressure that was not gentle, but was not unkind, more like a signal than a gesture of comfort. Then she stepped back, looked once toward the store window, and was gone inside. Eleanor did not open the bundle on the street. She put it in her coat pocket and walked on. The Voss property sat at the eastern edge of town where the road began to lift toward the foothills, and the buildings thinned out into scrub and fence line. Thomas had built the cabin himself over the first summer of their marriage. Not a large structure, not a beautiful one by anyone's account except hers, but solid in the particular way of things built by someone who understood load-bearing and joinery and did not believe in shortcuts. The door frame was plumb. The window he had set facing east so the morning light would cross the bed. The porch had a slight list to the left that he had intended to fix every spring for 4 years. She did not let herself stand in the doorway and look at it the way she wanted to. That was another thing she did not have time for. Agnes sat in the chair by the cold hearth and watched Eleanor work with the particular quality of attention she had always brought to watching Eleanor work. Not supervisory, not worried, simply present in the way of someone who understands that the best thing they can offer is witness. Her hands were folded in her lap. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and the cabin was cold in a way that went past temperature into atmosphere, the cold of a space that had begun to understand it was losing its purpose. Eleanor moved through the rooms with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. The cast iron pot, she lifted it and set it aside. Thomas had bought it on his first trip to Cheyenne, carried it the full 40 miles back, wrapped in his coat because he did not want it to chip. The axe by the door hickory handle worn smooth at the grip, the head still true after 12 years of use. Thomas sharpened it every Sunday after church, the same way, the same number of strokes, as methodical as prayer. 2 sacks of flour, one nearly empty, the salt in its covered crock, the last tin of coffee, which she set aside first, which she wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth, before anything else, because there are things you preserve, not for their practical value, but for what they mean to continue having. The Bible that had been Agnes's mother's Bible, its spine cracked, its pages foxed and soft. She packed it not because she had been on good terms with faith recently, but because some things you carry for continuity, for the thread they represent back through time, to women who had also needed something to hold on to. She packed the blankets, Thomas's heavy coat, which was too large for her and which she packed anyway, the small waterproof tin of matches, the lantern, and the extra oil. Agnes had begun folding the remaining blanket, the one she had kept across her knees at the meeting, with the slow and deliberate movements of her hands, doing what they had always done when there was nothing else they could do. It was not an idle gesture. It was the gesture of someone preparing in the only language their body still spoke fluently. Eleanor watched those hands for a moment. She thought about the particular courage that lived in small, careful acts performed in the presence of large, terrible ones. Outside, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind moving down from the grayback range had teeth in it that the morning wind had not had. The temperature was dropping with the straightforwardness of a thing that has no interest in gradation. She took the hand sled from the lean-to behind the cabin. Thomas had built it for hauling firewood, a simple low-bodied affair with runners he had shod with iron strips. She loaded it with everything she had packed, distributed the weight the way he had taught her, lashed it down with the rope from the barn. Then she looked at Belle. The cow was 11 years old, lean through the ribs in the way of an animal who has given more than she has taken for a long time, her winter coat rough and dull, her breath steaming with patience. She had been their cow for 9 years. She had calved 3 times in the stall. Eleanor could see from the kitchen window. She had given milk through drought years and through the summer, when the creek ran low, and through the winter 2 years back when Eleanor had worried every morning that she would find her down. She was not a young animal, not a particularly robust one, but she was steady in the way of a creature who has simply decided to continue. And that quality Eleanor thought was worth more than robustness. She tied a rope to Belle's halter. Belle turned her head to look at her with the mild, uncomplicated acceptance of an animal who had decided long ago that wherever Eleanor was going was probably fine. The town watched them leave. Eleanor did not need to look to know it. She could feel it, the particular pressure of eyes on the back of a person who has just been made into a lesson about what happens. Faces behind glass, figures stepping back from doorways. She had lived in this town 6 years. She had known these people through hard winters and difficult seasons, and the small accumulating weight of ordinary shared life. None of them came out. She put her shoulder into the rope of the hand sled, felt the first resistance of the runners against the frozen ground, and leaned. The sled moved. She walked. The foothills at the base of Grayback Mountain were deceptive in the way of terrain that looks passable from a distance and reveals its intentions only once you are committed. The ground rose steadily for the first mile along an old prospector's track, packed enough in summer to be serviceable, now drifted over in places, and hidden in others, the underlying rock glazed with ice where water had seeped and frozen. Eleanor kept her eyes on the ground immediately ahead. She had learned this from Thomas, who had learned it from a man who had crossed the Rockies twice. Do not look at the mountain. Looking at the mountain tells you how far you have to go. Looking at your feet tells you where to put them. The sled caught twice on buried rock, and she had to wrestle it free. Agnes lay on the sled without speaking, her face turned up toward the gray sky, her eyes open. The blankets Eleanor had tucked around her were shifting with the sled's movement, and once every little while Agnes would reach up with one thin arm and rearrange them with the precise economy of someone who has learned to manage what they can reach. Belle followed at the end of her rope, her hooves finding purchase with the careful deliberateness of old animals on uncertain ground, not pulling against the rope, not balking at the drifts, moving through the snow the way she had always moved through difficulty. At the 2-mile mark, Eleanor stopped to check her mother. The face visible above the edge of the top blanket was the color of winter sky. Not blue, not gray, but some colorless state between the two, with its own name in the vocabulary of cold. Her lips had no particular color. Her breath was there. Eleanor confirmed this by watching shallow but present each exhale, a thin ghost dispersing immediately. Then one exhale did not come. Eleanor pressed her fingers against her mother's neck at the jugular and found nothing for 1 second. Then two, and then it was there. Weak and irregular, but there. She took her mother's hands between her own and held them, not trying to take warmth, but to give it, and counted to 60 in her head, while the wind came down off the mountain and found every gap in her clothing it could find. "Still here," Agnes said without opening her eyes. Eleanor did not answer. She straightened and turned back to the rope and leaned into it again. The sled moved. She walked. She had been walking for almost an hour when she remembered the bundle. She stopped and reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the cloth with fingers that were beginning to go clumsy with cold. Inside dried tea leaves, their smell faint and good against the sterile air of the mountain. And folded inside the outer cloth, a rough sketch on paper, a path up Grayback Mountain with an X marked where the path ended. The handwriting beneath the sketch pressed hard against the paper, the writing of someone accustomed to working quickly in poor conditions. Ezra Calhoun lived here 6 years. He did not die of the cold. Eleanor read it twice, standing in the wind on the side of the mountain. 6 years. He did not die of the cold. The distinction mattered. It did not say he had survived. It said the cold was not what killed him, which meant something else had, which meant before that something else had arrived, he had built enough to make the cold irrelevant. Those were two very different statements, and Catherine Mercer, who pressed meaning into small gestures, with the precision of a woman who had learned to say everything in the margins, had understood the difference when she pressed that paper into Eleanor's hand. Eleanor folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. She looked up at the mountain. The light was going wrong by the time she reached what the sketch had marked. Not darkening the way light normally darkened in late afternoon, but flattening, losing its direction, becoming the kind of diffused gray that eliminated shadow and made distances impossible to judge. She was moving on memory of the sketch now on the instinct she had developed. Reading her father's survey maps as a child, learning to see in topographical lines the shape of things that actually existed. She found the notch in the ridge line. Below it, she saw nothing at first, only rock and snow, and the particular emptiness of a mountainside that had given up any pretense of hospitality. She stood for a moment in the cutting wind, her lungs aching, her legs telling her things she needed to not hear right now, and she looked. Then she saw darkness in the rock face below the notch. Not the darkness of shadow which was uniform, but a deeper darkness specific and bounded a hole that the eye kept returning to because it was somehow wrong in a way that was difficult to name. The rock around it was gray-white with ice, the ordinary dead gray of mountain granite in December. The darkness in that hole was different. And then she saw the mist rising from the opening, thin and barely visible, lighter than the surrounding air, not falling the way cold air falls, but rising, dispersing upward into the sky above. This air rose because it was warmer than the air it rose into. She pulled the sled the remaining 100 yards in something close to a controlled lurch, not running but moving with an urgency that was less decision than desperation, the specific acceleration of a person who has found the thing they stopped believing was there. The opening was a ragged vertical crack in the granite, roughly 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide at its widest point, not a cave entrance so much as a wound in the mountain, irregular and uneven, exhaling very faintly air that was not the same temperature as the air around it. Eleanor held her bare hand in front of the opening and felt not warmth exactly, but the absence of the killing cold, the absence of the wind, a stillness that was not the stillness of empty frozen space, but of enclosed space that had been doing something in the dark for a long time. She got Agnes off the sled first. Her mother weighed less than seemed possible, lighter than the sacks of flour, lighter than in the lantern, and the pot combined a weight that was less about mass than about the knowledge of what it represented to be carrying it. Eleanor got her arms under Agnes's shoulders and, knees lifted, carried her through the opening. Sideways, set her down on the rock floor inside. Then she went back for the sled. She got Belle through last. The cow balked once at the narrow entrance, one step forward and then a full stop, her large dark eyes regarding the crack in the mountain with calm bovine skepticism. Eleanor put her hand on Belle's neck just below the ear and waited. Belle's ear twitched. She considered. Then she folded herself through with the resigned practicality of an animal who had previously assessed that wherever Eleanor was going was probably fine and saw no reason to revise that assessment now. Inside, the silence was total. Not the silence of the outdoors, which was merely the absence of human noise against a background of wind and distance, but a deep subterranean silence that had mass that pressed against the ears. The wind, which had been the constant soundtrack of the last several hours, was simply gone. Not quieter, gone. Eleanor stood just inside the entrance and let herself breathe. The air smelled of mineral cold and old earth, something ancient and specific, a smell without any biological content, purely geological. The temperature was still cold, but it was a still cold, the kind you could manage, the kind that did not take things from you, the kind that left you with options. She found the lantern by Phil, got it unstrapped from the sled, found the match tin. Her fingers inside her wet gloves were stiff to the edge of useless. She took the gloves off, held her hands at her armpits for 30 seconds, then worked the tin open. The first match snapped at the head. The second hissed and went out. She cupped her hands around the third, brought it close to her chest to shield it from any movement of air, and struck it. The flame held, small, specific, vulnerable. She touched it to the lantern wick. The wick caught in warm yellow light, pushed out in a circle about 4 feet in every direction, and she held it up. They were in a low-ceilinged antechamber, the walls wet with seepage, the floor rough granite. Ahead, a passage narrowed before opening into something larger. She could sense the larger space without seeing it, the way a sound changes when a room gets bigger. The air from the passage was perceptibly warmer than the antechamber. Not warm, warmer. A difference that in any other context would be unremarkable, and in this context felt like a promise. She got Agnes upright, again got her shoulder under her mother's arm, and they moved into the passage. The second chamber stopped her. It was roughly 30 feet across. The ceiling was beyond the reach of her lantern light. The floor was relatively flat, smoother than the approach a gift from whatever geological process had formed the space. And against the far wall, she saw it. A stack of firewood cut and split and piled neatly, the wood gray with age, but solid, dense through. Beside it, a circle of stones arranged with care, a hearth long cold its chimney, a vertical crack in the rock above that disappeared into darkness. Next to the hearth, on a flat shelf of stone that jutted from the wall at a convenient height, a wooden box. She crossed the chamber in a dozen steps. The box was wrapped in oilcloth, stiff with age but still intact. She worked the cloth loose. Inside, a skinning knife with a bone handle, a flat grinding stone, a ball of twine, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a detailed diagram of the chimney fissure and its connection to the hearth, every dimension annotated in a careful hand. And beneath all of it, wrapped in its own separate piece of oilcloth, a notebook. She opened it. The first page bore a name in careful, deliberate handwriting. Ezra Calhoun. Beneath the name, a date, October 3rd, 1871. She carried it to where Agnes had managed to lower herself to the floor, her back against the cave wall, the blanket pulled up around her shoulders. Agnes's eyes were open, fixed on the wooden box on the hearth, on the stack of wood, doing the calculation that Eleanor was doing. Eleanor opened to the first page of text and read aloud, her voice barely carrying in the immense stillness. I came to this place because there was nowhere else left to go. They told me a man with a ruined leg is a mouth without hands. They told me this quietly, in the way people tell you things they believe are facts rather than choices. The boarding house that no longer had a room. The foreman who could not find work that needed doing. The sister's husband who looked at the floor when I came to visit. They are wrong about what a man is. I intend to prove it here or die in the attempt. But I will not go back. I will not stand in a doorway with my hat in my hand and ask for the judgment of people who have confused their own comfort with a verdict on my worth. Eleanor stopped. She looked up from the page. She looked at the stack of wood that a man she had never met had cut and split and piled against the wall of this mountain. At the hearth he had built by hand. At the chimney diagram folded carefully for whoever came after him. At the tools wrapped in oilcloth against the ears. Agnes was looking at her with those pale hawk eyes in the lantern light. Something moving in them that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but something older and more durable than either. He left this for us, Agnes said. Her voice was rough with cold, barely more than texture. He did not know our names, but he left this for us. Eleanor closed the notebook. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, which was not the weight of paper and ink, but of a man's years in a mountain, a man who had been told what he was worth and had declined to accept the assessment. The lantern flame stood perfectly still in the windless dark. She set the notebook on the flat stone shelf where Ezra Calhoun had left it. She took off her coat, folded it, set it on the ground beside her mother as a cushion. She picked up the lantern. She picked up one of the split logs from the top of the stack and walked to the hearth. She had never built a fire in a hearth she had not built herself. But the diagram was right there on the shelf, drawn in the careful hand of a man who understood that the work outlasting the worker depended on the instructions being clear enough for a stranger to follow. And she had built enough fires in enough conditions to understand the fundamental principle. She crouched in front of the cold stone circle and held the lantern low, studying the construction with the attention she would have given a map looking for what was there and what it meant. Then she began. She placed the first piece of kindling from the pile Ezra had left beside the hearth, small dry fragments that catch before they think about it in a loose pile at the center of the firebox. Larger pieces next crossed, leaving air between them. She picked up the matches. She struck one. It caught. The kindling took. She watched the small yellow flames move across the dry wood with a hunger that seemed disproportionate to their size, aggressive in the way of things that had been waiting a long time. Smoke began to move. She watched it, her breath held, watching the direction it chose. For 2 seconds, 3, it seemed to hesitate, to consider the cold, still air of the chamber and find it adequate. Then it made its decision. It rose, thin at first a thread, then with increasing conviction, pulled upward into the narrow throat above the firebox, drawn by whatever geological accident made this fissure in the mountain into a chimney. The low sound of a draft engaging a sound like held breath, finally released, filled the chamber. The flames brightened as fresh air was drawn across them from below. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She looked at the fire. She looked at the smoke going exactly where it was supposed to go. From behind her, she heard her mother's voice, very quiet, carrying in it something she had not heard since before Thomas died, something she had not been certain she would hear again. "The smoke goes up," Agnes said. "The fire did not fix everything." That was the first thing Eleanor learned about living in a mountain. It fixed the immediate problem, which was dying. It did not fix the cold that lived in the stone walls and the stone floor and the stone ceiling, the cold that had been accumulating in that rock for 10,000 years and was not going to yield to a few hours of burning cedar. It did not fix the hunger that arrived by the second morning with the particular authority of a thing that has been patient and is no longer willing to be. It did not fix the sound Agnes made in her sleep, a thin catch at the top of each inhale, that Eleanor tracked through the dark the way a sailor tracks a distant lighthouse, present and present and present, and then suddenly not. And the 3 seconds before it resumed being the longest 3 seconds available to a human being. What the fire fixed was the margin, and the margin was everything. Eleanor understood this by the end of the first full day. She understood it the way you understand things that are taught by conditions rather than by instruction, without ceremony, without the opportunity to take notes. The cave was not warm, but it was survivable. And survivable, she was learning, was a different country than comfortable with its own customs and its own economy and its own very precise definition of what counted as enough. She spent the first morning taking inventory of what Ezra Calhoun had left behind, moving through the second chamber, and then carefully into the passages beyond it, with the lantern held low and her other hand on the wall. He had marked his routes with chalk on the stone, small arrows and numbers that had held their shape through 9 years of underground air. She followed them with the attention of a student in a subject she had not chosen but intended to pass. The coal seam was where his notebook said it would be, in the left branching passage 90 feet from the main chamber, embedded in the wall at chest height, a dark vein in the gray granite that came away in chunks when she applied the flat end of the axe head. It burned differently than wood, slower and hotter, with a low blue-hearted flame that was less dramatic than the cedar fire and more reliable, the difference between a man who makes promises and a man who simply shows up. She rationed it the way Agnes had always rationed flour in thin years, not by how much she wanted to use, but by how long she needed it to last. The warm spring was 20 minutes deeper in the mountain past 3 junctions she marked with fresh chalk because Ezra's marks had faded in this section. The water came out of the rock at a temperature that was not warm by any standard she would have applied in December of 1887, but was not freezing, and in the economy of the cave that made it extraordinary. She filled the pot and carried it back. She heated it over the coal fire until steam rose from the surface, and she pressed the warm vessel against Agnes's hands each morning before anything else working, heat into the bones through the skin because it was the only medicine she had for what was happening to her mother's hands. She did not yet know what else she had. The answer to that question came from the notebook which she read each evening after the work of the day had used her body to the point where it needed to rest, whether she permitted it or not. She read by firelight slowly, not from difficulty with the words, but from the desire to extract everything they contain. Ezra Calhoun had been a corporal in the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry before the Battle of the Crater in July of 1864 changed what was possible for him. A Union mine packed with powder beneath Confederate lines at Petersburg, detonated in the pre-dawn dark, had opened a catastrophic breach in the Confederate defenses. But the assault that followed had been mismanaged into disaster. In the confusion, Ezra had been caught by the concussive force of a secondary explosion that shattered his left leg below the knee. The surgeons debated amputation 4 separate times across the months that followed, each time deciding against it, and the leg had fused itself back into something functional, if permanent pain was included in the definition of functional. He had returned to his hometown in western Pennsylvania to find that the men who knew him before the war were willing to say they were glad he was back, but the actual content of gladness was limited. A carpenter who could not climb scaffolding was not a carpenter the trade had use for. The invitations to dinner lasted 1 winter. By the second, people had adjusted their routes through town to avoid the particular awkwardness of encountering a man they had rather not have to look at. Not from cruelty, Ezra wrote, from the specific discomfort of witnessing a need you have decided not to meet. That distinction, he noted, did not make the experience meaningfully different from the receiving end. Eleanor read that sentence twice. She set the notebook down on her knee and looked at the fire and thought about Roy Taft walking down the hallway ahead of her and not turning around, and about Ward Hollis finding something very interesting to look at on the wall beside him, and about 12 men sitting around a table her husband had built and looking mostly at the table when Mercer read out the verdict. Not from cruelty, from the specific discomfort of witnessing a need they had decided not to meet. She picked up the notebook and kept reading. The mushrooms appeared exactly where Ezra said they would, pale and smooth-capped, growing in clusters on the damp stone above the warm spring. She ate one alone and waited a full day, as he had advised, sitting with the patience of someone who has learned that the cost of being wrong about this particular question is not recoverable. Nothing happened except that she was slightly less hungry than she had been. After that, she gathered them weekly, adding them to the thin broth she made from their reserves, a broth that was not enough but was the mathematical difference between alive and not alive. 15 days into the mountain, Clement Ford arrived. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of someone moving carefully through the outer passage, a deliberate footfall that announced itself rather than sneaking. Ford was 50 years old, built with the compressed efficiency of a man who had spent 4 decades moving through wilderness, and he stood in the entrance to the main chamber and looked at the fire at Belle lying on the far side of the hearth, at Agnes against the wall, and then at Eleanor, and his face went through a sequence of adjustments that she watched with the detached interest of someone observing a complicated mechanism sort itself out. "The whole town thinks you're dead," he said finally. "Both of you. They said prayers at Christmas." Eleanor considered this information. "That was kind of them," she said in a tone that made clear she had not yet decided whether it was. He sat by the fire and drank the warm water she offered because she had no coffee left, and he knew better than to say anything about that. He looked around the chamber with the repetitive attention of a man trying to memorize what he was seeing because he understood that no verbal account of it would be believed. When he left, he carried a story with him. And in the particular information economy of a small isolated town in the grip of a hard winter, that story moved fast. 3 days later, the first visitors came. Not to help, they came with the eyes of people who had concluded that someone was keeping a secret they were entitled to share. The winter had been as brutal as predicted. Livestock casualties throughout the valley, feed stores running thin, families who had calculated their provisions adequately in November discovering by January that adequate and sufficient were not the same thing. The first man through the passage wanted to know about gold. He had heard there was a seam, had heard it from someone who had heard it from someone who had been hearing a version of this particular story about Grayback Mountain for 30 years, the story mutating slightly with each telling until it had the convincing texture of fact. His eyes moved across the cave walls with the rapid assessment of a man calculating assets. Eleanor told him there was no gold. He did not believe her with the particular thoroughness of someone whose plan for the next 6 months required there to be gold and who therefore could not afford to revise the belief on the basis of what she said. She gave him warm water and a place by the fire for an hour. She told him about the mushrooms near the spring. She said nothing about the coal seam. She gave what she could give. Not from the mathematics of it, which were not favorable, but from the understanding her mother had spent 30 years trying to pass along that surviving without a sustaining reason is just a slower variety of ending, and that the sustaining reason for a person of any worth is always in some essential way out of other people. But she gave carefully. A margin is not a surplus, and she was still learning the exact dimensions of hers. Then on a morning in the third week of January, Dr. Emmett Hale appeared at the foot of the mountain. She knew about it because Ford came up 2 days before with a message. Hale was the only physician within 40 miles of Coldwater Junction, 45 years old, with the lean economy of a man who forgot meals because he was thinking about something else. He had declined to make the climb to examine Agnes. His reasoning, as Ford relayed it with the flattened voice of someone repeating words they found difficult, was that there was no one to authorize payment, no husband to sign, no property to secure against fees. He did not make a practice he had apparently said of climbing mountains to treat patients without means. Eleanor listened to this, standing in the main chamber with the coal fire burning low behind her and Agnes asleep in the corner. The notebook, she said. Ezra wrote about treatments, about the willow bark for fever, about the yarrow. I've been working from that. I know, Ford said. That's what I told him. He paused. He said if you're working from a dead man's notes without training, you might kill her before the cold does. The silence after this had weight. Tell him, Eleanor said, that I am open to better information if he is willing to provide it without conditions. Ford looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and went back down the mountain. 2 days later, Hale came up alone. He arrived at the cave entrance in the early afternoon with a leather bag and the expression of a man who had made a decision he was still in the process of justifying to himself. He was thinner than she had expected, the kind of thin that comes from sustained concentration rather than deprivation, and his wire-rimmed glasses had a small crack in the left lens that he had apparently decided to live with rather than replace. He stood in the entrance to the second chamber and looked at the setup with professional attention, not commenting on the construction, not remarking on the improbability of what he was seeing. He crossed to Agnes, crouched beside her, and examined her with his hands in his eyes for 15 minutes, while Eleanor stood back and watched and said nothing. When he straightened, he looked at Eleanor directly for the first time since he had entered the cave. The willow bark preparation you're using, he said. You're underdosing. It's managing her discomfort, but it's not doing enough work on the inflammation. He told her the correct ratio, the correct timing, what to watch for if the fever spiked. 3 specific pieces of information delivered in a physician's voice, clean and without decoration. Eleanor listened. She repeated each piece back to confirm she had it correctly. He nodded once. The steam, he said. Continue that. The humidity is helping her lungs more than anything else you're doing. He looked around the chamber once more. At the fire, at the organized equipment, at the notebook on the shelf. Then he looked at Eleanor's hands, which were marked by 6 weeks of work in a stone cave in winter, calloused and cut and stained with coal dust and pine resin. There is no fee, he said, and he picked up his bag and left. She heard his footsteps receding through the outer passage, and then nothing. Eleanor stood in the chamber for a moment. She understood what had just happened without being entirely certain why it had happened, which was a condition she had learned to accept in this mountain. Some things resolved themselves by their own logic without requiring her to name the mechanism. She went to the notebook and found the willow bark entry and added Hale's correction in the margin in her own handwriting, the way Ezra had made his own corrections to his original entries across 6 years of revision. The notebook was becoming a conversation between people who had never met and would never meet, conducted through the medium of what they had each learned and considered worth passing on. It was Ward Hollis who arrived next, but not in the way she had expected. He came up on a morning 10 days after Hale's visit with his wife Aggie, a step behind him and his face carrying the expression of a man who has been arguing with himself for a long time and has not won. Both his forearms were wrapped in cloth that had been clean at some point and was not anymore. Aggie walked with the careful posture of someone in pain who is not going to say so unless directly asked. Chimney fire. Their cabin the night before last. A flue that had been building creosote since October ignited in the pre-dawn hours gave them time to get out or time to grab something, but not both. Ward had grabbed Aggie. The burns on his forearms were from pushing through the door. The town had offered them the corner of the livery stable where the smell was strongest. Ford had sent them up the mountain. Ward set Aggie down near the fire and then straightened and looked at Eleanor. And what she saw in his face was the specific reckoning of a man who has arrived at a place he has no right to arrive at and knows it and has come anyway because there is nowhere else to go. I was at the meeting, he said, in December. I know you were, Eleanor said. I didn't say anything. He was not looking at her hands or at Agnes or at the cave. He was looking directly at Eleanor in the way that costs something. I've thought about it every day since. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Agnes had told her once years ago about the difference between a man who knows he did wrong and a man who acts differently because he knows. Those were two different men, Agnes had said, and you cannot know which kind you have until they are tested again. She would have time to find out. Sit down, she said, and let me see your arms. She worked on his burns with the yarrow preparation and the rendered fat and clean cloth, following the method Ezra had documented after his own encounter with an ember in his second winter, and one adjustment she had made to his ratio based on what Hale had told her about inflammation. Ward did not make a sound during this process. Aggie sat close to the fire and began slowly to stop shaking. While she worked, Eleanor talked. Not about the burns, not about what had happened to their cabin. She talked about the cave, the way the coal seam worked, where the water spring was, how long the mushrooms took to dry once picked, how the chimney draft behaved in different wind conditions outside. She talked about Ezra Calhoun, the facts of him, the notebook, the 6 years of systematic problem solving that had made this place survivable. She told Ward and Aggie because information was the most durable thing she could give them, more durable than food or warmth or whatever was being offered back in the livery stable. A man who understood what this mountain was and how it worked was less likely to feel like a charity case on it. Ward and Aggie stayed 6 weeks. By the end of the 3rd week, Ward was managing the coal extraction without supervision. He had developed a modification to the extraction angle that reduced the effort required by a third. He mentioned this to Eleanor with the careful caution of someone who was not sure he had the standing to improve on an established system. Write it in the notebook, Eleanor said. Put your name next to it. The expression on his face when she said that was not something she was able to categorize in the moment. She filed it away to think about later. Then Silas Brandt came. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in early February, and he did not come alone. Eleanor heard them from inside the passage before she saw any light. 3 sets of footsteps on the outer rock, the particular rhythm of men moving with purpose rather than caution. She was at the hearth when their lanterns appeared in the entrance, and she did not move. Brandt was 44, heavy through the shoulders, with the specific density of a man whose physical strength had always solved more problems than his thinking had. He owed money to people in Cheyenne whose interest in repayment was not strictly financial, and he had been on Grayback Mountain twice before in Prior Springs with a pickaxe and the persistent belief that the mountain owed him something for the effort. The mountain had declined to share this view. Now he was here in February, which was not the season for prospecting, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about how his situation had changed. He walked into the main chamber and let his gaze move across it with the systematic assessment of a man calculating what could be carried. His 2 companions spread to either side of him with the practiced spacing of people who wanted their presence noticed. Agnes was in her usual position against the far wall, the blanket arranged around her. Her eyes open. She had been drifting in and out of a half-sleep that had been becoming increasingly indistinguishable from waking. But her eyes were open now, and they were on Brandt with an attention that Eleanor recognized, and Brandt did not yet. Brandt's gaze settled on the passage leading deeper into the mountain. He took a step toward it. Agnes spoke. She did not raise her voice. The voice she used was quiet, conversational, the voice of someone noting the condition of the road or the likelihood of snow. It was also the voice of a woman who had spent 70 years perfecting the precise calibration of tone that communicates absolute certainty without requiring the noise of anger. The man who went back there last spring took 4 days to find his way out, Agnes said. I've counted the forks in those passages. 43. Give or take a few I may have lost count of. A pause, brief and precise. The bones of the one who didn't make it are somewhere in the fourth branch, I think. The dark makes it difficult to be certain about distances. Brant stopped. He was not a stupid man. That would have been easier. He was a man whose intelligence had been applied exclusively to the problem of what other people could be made to give up, which meant he was well calibrated to the specific weight of uncertainty. The torch he held cast its circle of orange light into the passage ahead of him, and the passage beyond that circle was not dim. It was absolute. The dark in the deeper mountain was of a quality that absorbed light rather than merely being unlit a darkness with a physical property that the torchlight made more apparent rather than less, because the light showed you exactly where its authority ended. 43 Forks. He stood at the entrance to the passage for a long moment. Then he turned back. His face arranged itself into an expression intended to communicate that he was choosing to leave rather than being turned by an old woman sitting on a cave floor. It almost achieved this. Almost. He looked at Eleanor when he spoke, not at Agnes. I'll be back. It was not only a threat. There was something in it that sounded like a promise he was making to himself, a man committing to a thing, so he did not have to acknowledge he was retreating. His two companions had already shifted toward the entrance. They did not look at either woman as they left. After they were gone, the chamber was quiet for a long time. Belle's breathing moved her sides in their slow rhythm. The fire said what fires say. Eleanor looked at her mother. Agnes had closed her eyes again. The performance of absolute authority had cost something. Eleanor could see it in the slight deepening of the stillness around her, the way the body conserves after an expenditure that is drawn from reserves. 43, Eleanor said. Agnes's lips moved something that occupied the territory of a smile without committing to it. It could be 43, it could be 4. He doesn't know the difference. Fear will do the arithmetic for him. Eleanor stayed awake that night after Agnes had fallen into her thin, recurring sleep. She lay beside the fire with her eyes on the ceiling of the chamber and thought about Brant with the focused practicality of someone who has accepted that a problem exists and is entirely occupied with solving it. He would come back. Men whose plans required a particular outcome always came back because the alternative was to acknowledge the plan was wrong, and some plans were too load-bearing to be wrong. The question was not whether he would return. The question was what the room would look like when he did. She got up before the light changed, took the lantern into the outer passage, and walked to the point where it narrowed to its minimum width, before the entrance a gap between two granite faces where the ceiling dropped low enough that a person of average height needed to duck. She walked through it 3 times, noting where the walls were closest, where the ceiling was lowest, where a person moving with confidence would need to slow and bend. She came back to the chamber and opened the notebook to the section she had been building toward without fully naming it. Ezra's second-year entry about the counterweight system designed against mountain lion intrusion, a suspended stone and trip rope arrangement at the passage's narrowest point. She read it through once, then again. Then she went to the stone wall of the chamber and began to select rocks. She was not building a weapon. She thought about this carefully and decided it deliberately the way she made every decision in this mountain, not from instinct, but from the clear-eyed assessment of what a decision would produce downstream. A dead man in her passage created problems that extended far beyond the immediate situation, problems involving the law and the town, and the specific exposure of a woman alone on a mountain who could not afford the kind of attention that came with a body. What she needed was not a stone large enough to kill. She needed a stone large enough to knock a man out of his certainty, to take his balance, to strip him of the composed authority that was his only actual weapon. A man on his knees in the dark, in a space where he has to move on all fours to get upright, is not the same man who walked in with a rifle over his shoulder. She worked through the morning. Agnes watched her from the wall, saying nothing. The fire burned. Belle moved once, adjusting her position, and then was still again. By midday, Eleanor had the stone suspended. The rope set the trigger mechanism in position at the precise point where a person ducking through the low section would be committed to the posture and unable to recover quickly. She ran through it twice in her head, tracing the geometry of it, finding the angles. It would work. She was certain it would work. She told Agnes what she had built. Her mother listened without opening her eyes. Your grandmother Eleanor, she said when Eleanor finished, used to say that you don't have to outfight a man who has already frightened himself. Ezra's design, Eleanor said. Agnes's hands moved slightly in her lap, a small and precise gesture of acknowledgement. He left you the plans. You built the thing. A pause. Those are two different things. Eleanor looked at the rope in her hand. She looked at the passage entrance, at the stone hanging in the shadows above the narrow point, invisible to anyone moving through from the outside. She thought about the notebook on the shelf, about the entry that ended mid-sentence in February of 1879, about a man who had built everything he could build and written everything he could write and then run out of time. She had his plans. She had built the thing. Outside, Grayback Mountain offered the wind everything it had. Inside, the fire drew, and in the passage above the narrow point, the stone waited with the patience of stone, which is to say it did not wait at all. It simply hung there ready to be what it needed to be when the moment arrived, which Eleanor had learned was the only kind of readiness that actually counted. Brant would come back, and when he did, the mountain would be ready. Brant came back on a morning in late February, and he came alone. That told Eleanor something before he reached the entrance. A man with options brings company. A man who has run out of room comes alone so that no one witnesses the outcome, whatever that outcome turns out to be. She heard his boots on the outer rock through the passage walls, a single set of footsteps moving with the careful confidence of someone who has been thinking about a place for 3 weeks and has convinced himself he understands it now. She was already behind the interior wall when his lantern light appeared. In the weeks since his first visit, Eleanor had built what she thought of simply as the adjustment to the chamber. A waist-high barrier of stacked stone crossing the main space at its far end, leaving only a low gap at the center knee height, the kind of opening a person had to commit to on hands and knees to pass through. The rope for the counterweight hung in her right hand. The axe lay on the floor beside her within reach unraised because she had thought through what she needed from this encounter, and a raised axe was not it. Brant came through the entrance passage bent low, his lantern swinging. He straightened inside the chamber, raised the light, and saw the wall. She watched his shoulders change. A slight settling, a recalculation happening somewhere behind his eyes. He moved toward the gap. He had to lower himself to pass through it. He put one hand on the stone floor, ducked his head, brought his left knee down. Eleanor pulled the rope. The stone did not hit him. The angle she had worked out over 2 days of geometry brought it into the gap itself. Stone striking stone, and the sound in the enclosed chamber was enormous. A concussive crack that the walls threw back from every direction at once. It knocked the lantern from his hand. The lantern skidded across the floor, still burning, coming to rest 6 feet away on its side. Brant went down on both knees in the sudden chaos of it, in the ringing after the impact, in the specific disorientation of a man whose confident model of a situation has just been revised without his consent. He was on his knees. His lantern was not in his hand. The gap behind him was sealed by stone. The passage he had come through was behind him, and the dark was in front of him. And from somewhere in that dark came Eleanor's voice, arriving from no single direction, because the stone walls of the chamber distributed sound, the way water distributes itself in a closed vessel. "You fell into my home," she said. "You can stand up and walk out the way I'm going to light for you, or you can stay and work through what's past this wall without a guide. I know every turning, you don't know one of them." The silence lasted 5 seconds. She counted them. Brant got to his feet. He retrieved his lantern. He stood in the chamber he was now effectively contained within and looked at the sealed gap and at the wall and at the darkness of the main passage behind him. She could see him from a gap between stones in the wall, a strip of his face in the lantern light, and she watched him do the calculation that she had made her own version of weeks ago when she first understood she was going to have to solve this problem without anyone's help. What is the actual cost of walking away measured against the theoretical cost of not walking away? He walked away. Eleanor took the secondary lantern and moved through the parallel passage she had mapped in December, keeping pace with his retreating steps, her light crossing his through the gaps in the rock, so that he understood she was there, understood the walls between them, understood that the mountain was tracking him on his way out. She stood at the entrance and watched him move down the slope through the snow, his back to her, not turning. She went back inside. She stood in the main chamber with the fire running and the stone wedged in the gap, and Belle asleep on the far side of the hearth. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and for the first time since December, she let her hands do nothing. She sat with the doing nothing. She sat with the weight of what had just happened and with the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something at bay for a very long time and has just confirmed for the first time since they started holding that it can be held. From Agnes's corner, her mother's voice arrived thin but clear. "Well," Agnes said. Eleanor agreed. "Well." Agnes was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, there was something in her voice directed outward rather than inward, something that had made the effort to cross the distance. "You built that yourself." Eleanor looked at her hands, the coal dust in the creases, the new scar across the right palm from the stonework, the older burn from the first failed hearth that had faded to a line. "Ezra drew the plans," she said. "You built it," Agnes said and did not say anything further. The point had been made in its complete form. Agnes Pryor Weston died on a morning in late March when the air outside the mountain carried for the first time the faint mineral scent of melting snow. Not warmth, not yet, but the first suggestion that warmth was being considered somewhere in the seasonal apparatus. It was a Tuesday. Eleanor knew because she had been marking the days on the cave wall with chalk since November, and she checked the marks before she did anything else each morning, because knowing where you were in time was a form of control when everything else was uncertain. She had known it was coming. The breath had changed first not in rate or pattern, but in some quality beneath those things, something about the way it moved the air differently. The sleep had deepened in a way that was different from rest, different from the exhausted sleep of someone whose body had worked hard and needed recovery. It was the sleep of something relinquishing its purchase on a surface it had held for a long time. She had talked to Agnes through those last nights the way she always talked to her about practical things. The garden she would plant near the cave entrance when the ground softened. The arrangement she intended to make with Ford for trapping snares on the upper slopes. The two passages she had not yet fully mapped. She talked about these things because they were real, because the future they implied was real, because she refused to sit by her mother and speak in the register of someone who had already begun the work of mourning before the person in front of them was gone. Agnes had been more present in those last nights than her body suggested she should be. Her eyes opened sometimes for long intervals, focused in a way that seemed to operate independently of everything else. 2 nights before the end, Agnes had said what she said about Eleanor's hands, about carrying her up the mountain, about building the fire, about holding the place. Eleanor had held her mother's hand while she said it, feeling the bones beneath the skin, counting the intervals between each heartbeat against her palm. The morning she died, Eleanor woke to a silence she recognized before she understood it. She did not rush. She sat for a moment in the warmth of the chamber and held the last few seconds before confirmation, which were also the last few seconds in which certain things were still open rather than closed. Then she went to her mother. Agnes's expression was the expression of a person who has completed something they set out to do. The grief when it arrived was quieter than she had expected. Not the sudden obliteration that had come with Thomas, but something with a longer wavelength, something that moved through her, the way cold moves through stone, evenly and completely and without drama. She had known this woman for 29 years. She had known her first as mother, and then in the months on this mountain as person, as the 19-year-old Agnes Pryor, who had been afraid, who had loved a man before she understood what he was, who had stood in a doorway watching a road and then turned around and rebuilt what the road had taken. That knowing had been paid for by everything the mountain and the winter and the December council meeting had cost. It was worth every cent. She carried Agnes into the deep passage to the alcove she had identified weeks earlier. Smooth stone, naturally warmer than the outer chambers. She wrapped her in the blanket that had crossed her knees at the council meeting on December 5th, the last domestic object that still held the smell of their house on the eastern edge of town. She placed the stones one by one, selecting each for its fitness, working with a slowness that was not ceremony but was not ceremony either. When she was done, she spoke to Agnes in the cave's absolute dark, with only the lantern saying the things that were true. That Agnes Pryor Weston had fed them both on nearly nothing. That she had managed their resources with a precision that would have impressed a trained quartermaster. That she had driven 3 armed men from this cave with 43 fictitious forks in a passage. That she had taught Eleanor everything worth knowing about the relationship between patience and power. That she had died warm in a home her daughter built, with her work complete and her dignity intact. Eleanor walked back to the main chamber. The fire was still burning. She opened Ezra Calhoun's notebook to the first blank page after his final entry and picked up the pencil and began to write. Spring came to Grayback Mountain the way it always came to high country, not as an arrival but as a negotiation. The snow line retreating by day and advancing by night in an argument that took weeks to resolve. Eleanor went down the mountain for the first time since December on the 10th of April. The path she had worn into the snow over 4 months of daily movement between the cave entrance and the woodpile and the water collection point had softened into mud. She left the sled. She walked down alone with only her pack and the pelts she had cured through the winter following the line of her own December descent. The mountain now showing her in daylight, the landscape she had crossed in the dark and the cold on the night she arrived. It looked different in April. Still difficult, the grade was real, and the exposed rock faces still held ice in the shaded sections. But survivable, navigable. The kind of difficult that a person with knowledge and adequate preparation could move through without being destroyed by it. Coldwater Junction appeared through the last of the trees smaller than memory. The buildings had the particular quality of structures that have been asked to carry too much weight for too long. The main street still rutted deep from winter traffic. The town had the look of something that had come through and was not yet certain whether to feel relief or exhaustion. She walked Commerce Street at a pace that was neither slow nor hurried. She looked at the faces that turned toward her, not defiantly, not triumphantly, but with the level attention of someone who has nothing to perform for anyone. She had walked out of this town in December as a verdict. She was walking back into it as a fact. Facts require no particular expression. Harold Mercer was on the porch of his store when she came level with it. He had aged through the winter in the visible way of men whose authority is their primary vitality. Something had shifted in the settled ease she had noticed at the council meeting, replaced by a watchfulness that did not sit naturally on him. His hands were on the porch railing. She went past him into the store and set her pack on the counter and untied it and laid out the pelts. The young man behind the counter, Mercer's assistant, looked at them and named a figure. She countered. He accepted. She took salt flour, a paper of needles, 2 packets of vegetable seed, and a variety of potato known to do well in rocky soil at altitude. She shouldered her pack and walked back out through the door. Mercer had not moved from the railing. The distance between them was 12 feet. Neither of them moved to close it. She looked at him with the same attention she had given everything else on the street, and she saw in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes were working that he was searching for the version of this encounter in which the arithmetic of the December council meeting still resolved in his favor. She watched him look for it. He could not find it. She walked on. The legal document had arrived in the 3rd week of May, delivered by the circuit rider who came through Coldwater Junction every 6 weeks. Eleanor was at the cave entrance tending the small garden she had begun in the cleared earth near the south-facing rock face when Clement Ford came up the path with an envelope and an expression that said he had been elected to deliver it by virtue of being the person most likely to survive the delivery. The document was from Mercer's attorney in Cheyenne, addressed to the territorial circuit court judge and copied to Eleanor Voss. It argued that the cave system known locally as Dead Man's Flue was situated on land designated for territorial use, that individual occupation without lease or claim filing was a violation of the Wyoming Territorial Land Act, and that the township of Coldwater Junction had standing to petition for removal of the current occupant. Eleanor read it twice, sitting on the rock near her bean row with the afternoon light falling at an angle across the page. She went inside. She took the notebook from the shelf. She sat at the flat stone she used as a working surface and spent the rest of that afternoon and the following morning writing a systematic account, dates of arrival for every person who had sheltered in the cave, names where she had them, the nature of the assistance provided, the condition in which they arrived, the condition in which they left. She had been keeping this record without fully understanding why the way you sometimes do a thing that the practical part of your mind has decided is necessary before the rest of you catches up to the reasoning. She added the technical sections, the hearth construction, the coal operation, the water system, the warm spring, Ezra's original diagram with her annotations. She cited the relevant passages from his notebook, establishing 6 years of habitation. At the bottom of her account, in a single declarative sentence, she wrote what she had been thinking since December. A municipal authority that declines to protect a resident during a life-threatening emergency has a complicated relationship with the concept of jurisdiction Over what that resident built to survive the emergency, it declined to address. She gave it to Ford to carry to the circuit judge's office in Buffalo. She kept a copy. The response took 6 weeks and arrived not as a formal ruling, but as a letter from the circuit judge himself addressed to both Harold Mercer and Eleanor Voss. A judge who has decided in favor of the petitioner does not address the reply to both parties. Eleanor understood this before she opened it. The letter stated that in the absence of clear precedent governing the improvement of public territorial land by a private individual for habitation and community welfare purposes, the court elected not to intervene in the current occupancy arrangement pending further legislative clarification. It noted that the documented provision of emergency shelter to multiple families during the winter of 1888 to 1889 constituted a public benefit the court considered relevant to the question of standing. It was not a complete victory. The word pending meant the question was not closed. But she was still on the mountain in the cave with her garden growing in the rocky soil and the notebook on the shelf and the fire burning in the hearth she had built with her own hands from the failure of the first attempt. She did not celebrate. She allowed herself 1 cup of coffee, brewed carefully drunk, sitting at the cave entrance in the evening light, watching what the sunset did to the grayback ridgeline, the granite moving through amber and copper to a deep rose gray that lasted long enough each evening to make you believe it would last longer before it was gone. 3 days later, Harold Mercer climbed the mountain. She heard him in the spruce below the cleared area, breathing with the effort of a man not built for altitude and aware of it. He came through the tree line and stopped at the edge of the garden, looking at the 3 rows of beans already knee-high, the carrots she had been pulling, the potato plants with their first true leaves. He looked at the cave entrance. He looked at Eleanor, standing between the bean rows with soil on her hands. He was doing what she had watched him do at the council meeting in December, calculating. But what he was calculating had changed. In December, he had been working out what he could afford not to give her. Now he was working out something that had no clear name in the language men like Mercer used for their interior transactions. He cleared his throat. Thomas built that table well, he said. His voice carried something she had not heard in it before, not softness. He was not a soft man, but a weight around the words that suggested they were doing more work than their surface meaning required. It was the only sentence he could apparently find that was both true and adequate to the moment. And she understood, hearing it, that it was his way of saying Thomas's name in her presence, which was the closest he could come to acknowledging what the December meeting had meant, what the table had meant, what all of it had meant. It was not enough. She held that clearly and, without softening it, nothing he could say standing at the edge of her garden would constitute sufficient accounting. The scales did not balance. They were never going to balance. "I have coffee," she said. He sat on the flat rock near the entrance for 30 minutes. The conversation moved through the practical terrain of the town's condition, which families had come through the winter intact, the state of the livestock herds, the long-term implications of the January cold snap. Ordinary language carrying weight it was not designed to carry, but was being asked to carry anyway because neither of them had access to the language that would carry it properly. When he stood to leave, he paused at the edge of the cleared area. She had expected him to go. Instead, he looked at the entrance to the cave, at the faint smoke rising from the fissure in the rock above it, at the garden she had grown in soil that had no business growing anything. "Could I see it?" he said, "the hearth." She considered him for a moment. The request was not what she had expected, which meant it was probably the truest thing he had said since he arrived. She led him inside. He stood in the second chamber with the lantern light around him and looked at what she had built. Not just the hearth, but the stone wall, the organized equipment, the notebook on the shelf, the marks on the cave wall where she had tracked the days and the passages and the resources, the chalk arrows Ezra had made and the ones she had added beside them. The evidence of everything that had been done in this space to make it livable and then to make it something more than livable. He crossed to the hearth and stood before it. Then he placed his hand flat on the stone's palm down, the way a person touches something when they want to understand it through contact rather than through sight. He held it there. He looked at her. His eyes were doing something that had not been available to them in December, something that required the specific undoing that the winter and the letter and the climb up the mountain and the garden and the coffee had accomplished it in him. "Why?" he asked. The question was genuine. She could hear that it was genuine, which made it the first genuine thing he had directed at her since Thomas died. Eleanor thought about Ezra Calhoun, who had written everything down for a stranger he would never meet, who had stacked the wood and drawn the diagrams, and left the tools wrapped in oilcloth, and made the whole mountain survivable for the next person who needed it to be. She thought about Agnes, who had taught her every useful thing she knew through the simple repetition of doing those things in front of her until they became instinct. She thought about Ward Hollis writing his coal modification in the notebook and signing his name to it. Because information is worth more in circulation than it is in here, she said. She meant it in every sense available. Mercer's hand came off the hearthstone slowly. He nodded once, the single deliberate nod of a man making a private concession in a long argument, granting a point he has been contesting at cost to himself and to others for longer than was justified. It was not an apology. It was not restitution. It was the acknowledgement that she had been right and he had been wrong, and that these two facts could now be allowed to occupy the same space without either of them pretending otherwise. She accepted it for what it was. Ward Hollis came back in December of that same year on a Tuesday, the first anniversary of the council meeting, carrying his youngest child against his chest and his fear in his eyes in a way that a man like Ward Hollis, who had organized his life around not showing fear, found visibly difficult to manage. The child had been coughing for 10 days, a deep rattling cough that got worse in the cold, the sound of small lungs working too hard against air that was too thin and too frigid. The town's houses were not warm enough. The livery was worse. Ford had told Ward about the steam treatment, about the cave, about what Eleanor had done for the families who had come through the winter before. Ward stood at the cave entrance with the child in his arms, and he did not begin with an apology or an explanation. He held the child out toward Eleanor with the wordless gesture of a man who has run out of everything except the one action that might still matter. She took the child. She remembered standing in the hallway of the town hall 11 months ago, Ward's eyes finding the wall beside him, the specific quality of a man not seeing what was in front of him. She remembered what she had thought then, that the distance between being sorry and doing something was the exact width of Thomas's table, and Ward had been sitting on the wrong side of it. She had been right about that. She had also understood, even then, though she would not have used this language in December, that people sometimes needed time to cross that distance. The crossing was what mattered, not the length of time it took. She set the child near the fire and began the steam treatment, the pot of near-boiling water positioned where the curve of the cave wall created the humid warmth that opened airways. She had used it on Agnes on the Hollisburns, on two other children who had come through the cave in the spring with their parents. She knew what she was doing, Hauno, in a way she had not known in December, not from natural ability, but from accumulation from the notebook and from Hale's corrections and from the practice of doing the thing repeatedly until her hands knew it before her mind did. Ward sat across the fire from her and watched. Aggie was beside him, her hand in his. "I should have spoken," Ward said. He was looking at the child, not at Eleanor. "At the meeting, when Mercer read the charter." He stopped. "I knew it was wrong. Every person in that room knew it was wrong, and I sat there." Eleanor kept her attention on the child, on the sound of the breathing on the small chest moving with increasing ease as the steam did its work. "You're here now," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it's not." The silence after this was honest rather than comfortable, which Eleanor had come to value more than comfort, because honest silence at least stood on real ground. The child's breathing changed over the course of that first evening, the rattle loosening the labor, decreasing by increments too small to see, but accumulating into something she could hear by the time she banked the fire for the night. Ward and Aggie stayed for 2 weeks. On the day they left, Aggie held Eleanor's hands in both of hers and looked at them for a moment without speaking. "These hands," Aggie said finally, and did not finish the sentence because the sentence did not need finishing. It was already complete. By the third winter, the cave had a name that Eleanor had not given it. People in Coldwater Junction had stopped saying "dead man's flu" and started saying the shelter lowercase with the matter-of-fact usage that attaches to a thing that has become simply part of the landscape, a given rather than a novelty. The name change recorded something that the legal document from the circuit judge had been unable to quite articulate, that the place was not defined by the death that had ended Ezra Calhoun's sentence, but by the accumulated fact of everyone who had been kept alive within its walls since. On an evening in the 5th year, Eleanor sat at the cave entrance and watched the last of the light leave the grayback ridgeline and thought about what she would write in the notebook that night. She had been filling the back pages slowly since March of the first year, alongside Ezra's entries in the front, the two halves of the book moving toward each other like two people walking from opposite ends of a road. She had added Ward's coal modification in his own handwriting. She had added a section in a child's hand that turned out to be Pearl Greer's observations about which mushroom clusters grew back fastest after harvesting. She had added Hale's dosage correction attributed to him by name. The notebook was no longer Ezra's or hers, it was the cave's. She went inside, took it from the shelf, opened to the page with Ezra's final entry. The sentence that stopped in the middle of a word about a wall he was repairing in February of 1879. She had read this page many times. Each time she read it, she sat with what it contained, the full life of a man compressed into the space between one word and the silence after it, and whatever had stepped through the entrance in the dark and ended that life and left the sentence open. She could not close that particular sentence. No one could. But she could write after it in the space that came after the silence, the way you continue a conversation that was interrupted not by disagreement, but by circumstance. She put the pencil to the page. He finished the wall, she wrote. He always finished the wall, whatever came after the wall held. Then she turned to the back of the notebook, to the last pages that still had blank space remaining, and she wrote the passage she had been composing in her mind for 3 years, through every winter night when the fire ran and the mountain breathed its slow, subterranean breath, and the dark outside the entrance contained everything that had tried to stop her and failed. Ezra Calhoun was here. Then I was here. Then my mother and Thomas in memory, and Ward, and Aggie, and the Greer family, and everyone who came after them and before whoever reads this. None of us arrived because we were strong. We arrived because we had run out of everywhere else. The mountain did not care about our reasons. It offered what it offered. Cold stone and deep dark and a chimney fissure and a coal seam and a warm spring and the work of a man who understood that what you build belongs to whoever needs it. We built on what he left. Others will build on what we leave. She set the pencil down. She read what she had written. Then she added one more line, the line she had been saving for last, because some things need to wait until you are certain they are true. The door is open. It has always been open. You only have to understand that the mountain is not trying to kill you. It is trying to find out what you are made of. She put the notebook back on the shelf where Ezra Calhoun had placed his. She picked up the axe and went outside to split the last of the evening's firewood before the light was fully gone. The smoke from the chimney fissure rose into the Wyoming dark, thin and straight in the still air, warm against the cold sky visible from a long way down the mountain to anyone who knew where to look. Below, the lights of Coldwater Junction were small and scattered in the valley, each one a household making its calculations against the cold, each one a person deciding what they could afford and what they could not, and what the night required of them. She split the wood. She stacked it the way Ezra had stacked it, the way she had stacked it every evening for 5 years. She carried an armful inside and set it beside the hearth and fed 3 pieces to the fire and watched the flames adjust to the new fuel and then settle into the long, slow burn that would hold through the night. Belle was long gone now, buried where the first wildflowers came up in April, in the ground that softened earliest, which had seemed right. The cave was quieter without her, but it was not empty. Eleanor sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and her hands in her lap, and the fire in front of her, and the notebook on the shelf to her right, and 5 years of the mountain. All around her in the stone and in the chalk marks, and in the repaired joints of the hearth, and in the passages she could walk in the dark without a lantern, because she knew every turning by the feel of the air and the angle of the floor. Thomas had been the one who named things. She had always handed him the feelings she could not identify, and he had reached into the air and found the word. She had spent 3 years and more on this mountain without him to do that, and what she had learned slowly and without ceremony was that the feelings did not go unnamed just because he was not there to name them. They waited. And in time, working with your hands in the dark on things that mattered, you found the words yourself. What she felt sitting with her back against the cave wall in the evening of the 5th year, with the fire burning and the smoke rising and the notebook full and the door open behind her as it had always been, was not triumph. Triumph was too thin a word for it, too pointed, too concerned with what had been defeated rather than what had been built. What she felt was something closer to the word Thomas would have reached for if he had been sitting beside her which was simply this, that she was here, and she had made something real in a place where nothing real had been required of her, and that the making of it had cost everything she had and had been worth every cent of the cost, and that the door was open, and the fire was burning, and the mountain had found out what she was made of, and now they both knew.